Wait, what? Okay, I think that was a joke and I didn't catch it. No, it's really embarrassing. It's fine.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Good. This way, I'm good to go, but I don't get the echo. If it's okay with you, I'll start now. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What we'd like to talk about today is the impact of Islam and Muslims on the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality in the New World. And in the first slide, it says, in the name of Allah. If we look at the struggle for freedom from the worship and subjugation of the human spirit from anything except Allah, no human being, nothing except Allah. This is the first and fundamental principle in Islam, and it is what fuels the phenomenon of Muslims and Islam's impact on the freedom struggle among blacks in the Americas. In the next slide, we talk about before Columbus. And if you were to look into the history of Africans in the Americas, you know that it begins before the advent of Columbus with Mansa Abu Bakr II, who sails to the Americas around 1312 with approximately 1,000 ships. Now, these are small ships, and they land off the coast of Brazil. That journey is fueled because of the phenomenon of the currents that come off the coast of West Africa near Senegal. Had they sailed further north, they would have caught the currents in the next slide that led to the transatlantic slave trade. It's the curse of those currents that brought Africans from the west coast of Africa into the Caribbean and then up the coast of the United States at that time, the colonies, founding the first encampment or settlement in 1619, Jamestown in Virginia. There is in this phenomenon of the transatlantic slave trade a miscalculation. The slave ship captains were informed that because these Africans who were involved in civil war with one another spoke different languages, they were from different cultures, different religions, that somehow they would not be able to communicate with one another. What they had not calculated is that many of these peoples, tribes, nations, were actually Muslim. And therefore, there was some unifying concepts within their diversity. One report says that they could hear people in the body of the ship cry out, Allahu Akbar, and that others, enslaved Africans, responded to them, meaning that they could communicate with one another because of the commonality of Islam. Captain's logs reported that they then began to put a warning about taking Africans who were Muslim as a group, that they should be divided. They should be mixed in with others because they were deemed to be dangerous as cargo. Many of them would prefer to die than to be subjugated to slavery. In the Caribbean, you have the phenomenon of the Maroons, I mean. These Maroons, most famously the Maroons of Jamaica, but throughout the Caribbean, you'll find them also in the Gullah Islands off the Carolinas, and many of them maintain their Islamic identity by building encampments in the islands, small islands off the coast. Many of them, their cultural traditions remained, but it was these particular groups of Africans who were part of a runaway and emancipation movement, as well as many who would run away and become allies to Native Americans. So much so that there are a number of areas, cities, towns in the Americas, it's estimated over 50, that have Islamic names. And part of that is believed that it is from the early African Muslims who moved west and south, seeking freedom and making those alliances with the Native American people. And we were to go to the next slide, talking about inspired resistance. You have many famous Muslims who their life stories have been collected as anecdotes to a kind of Islamic resistance that was brought forward. Most notably in the records, you have individuals like Kunta Kinte or Omar ibn Said. Kunta Kinte was in the Maryland area where I am right now. Around the time 1767, something like that. And it was noted that he refused to eat pork because of his religious dietary practices. He attempted to run away many times and was captured. You have the phenomenon of Omar ibn Said, who refused again to eat pork. He was placed in a stockade, and after some period, they looked into the stockade and discovered that he is writing on the wall something which they believed that the enslaved Africans were illiterate. They asked him, what is he writing? He said, I'm writing my Bible. And they believed that after many years that Omar ibn Said had converted to Christianity, and he died sometime in the mid-90s, at the age of 90-something. And they had asked him, as an old man, would he write down something from the Bible in his language. It later was discovered that that note that he wrote was either the first chapter of the Quran or the chapter that is referred to as the help. When does the help of God come and the victory? He wrote that in Arabic. It's only later that people discovered, in fact, what he was writing, and his offspring continued to defy slavery through the practice of their faith. Let's go to the next slide. So we leave the 1800s, we're now in the 1900s. A very interesting phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of Marcus Garvey. Many believe Marcus Garvey, who came from Jamaica, went to England and was inspired in his move for freedom and independence for Africans with the help of a man whose name was Deuce Muhammad. If you see in the image above, Deuce Muhammad is the man wearing the fez. He had a tremendous influence on the thinking of Marcus Messias Garvey, who formed the largest Pan-Africanist movement unifying people of African descent throughout the diaspora. And by 1917, in a book written by Dr. Tony Martin from Rutgers, Tony Martin said that, Princeton, that in the conference of 1917, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, that was his organization, the UNIA, that Garvey said, I would like you to identify what should be the religion of the UNIA, this organization that is fighting for the freedom, justice, and equality for blacks at that time. And they come back with a resolution that says Islam should be the religion of the UNIA because most of the Africans throughout the diaspora, the majority of them practice the Islamic faith. Garvey, in the next slide, Garvey identifies politically that in the Americas and in the Caribbean, that's not going to fly. But he leaves room inside the UNIA and African Communities Leagues, leaves room for the expression of Islam and Islamic, whether they're heterodoxical, but Islamic ideas. Out of that movement comes two individuals. A man at that time named Elijah Poole, who would take the name Elijah Muhammad. And in 1929, after the arrest and incarceration of Marcus Garvey and deportment, he forms the Nation of Islam. Another lieutenant from Garvey's movement, a gentleman by the name of Drew Ali, who becomes known in history as the Noble Drew Ali, creates something called the Moorish Science Temple, holding up the notion that the Africans in America have had their land, their language, their culture, and their religion stolen from them, and that they want to emancipate themselves, and so they form the Moorish Science Temple. Interestingly enough, during the period of, next slide, of the Harlem Renaissance, you're going to see a cultural expression of this resistance through the lens of art, music, poetry, within the framework of the Harlem Renaissance. If you notice, for those of you who might be jazz enthusiasts, that the man wearing the turban and blowing the trumpet is Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie became very enamored with the ideas of liberation theology promoted through the Ahmadiyya movement, as well as the man you see leaning back playing the drums. His name is Art Blakey, and he forms an organization, a band called the Islamic Jazz Messengers. And their music, along with the music of many others who are influenced in that period, are all using an Islamic liberation theology within the framework of their arts and cultures. And there are many more. We don't have time to go through them, but this is a profound movement within the cultural framework, and you're going to find during that period people like Malcolm X and others are going to frequent the places where these Islamic jazz messengers are laying down the message. Art Blakey later drops the phrase Islamic, and now that band of record is known as the Jazz Messengers. But it originally was the Islamic Jazz Messengers. Let's go to the next slide, talking about when the Nation of Islam becomes synonymous with Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is a product of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, and their religious liberation theology. He inspires and radicalizes the civil rights movement. So even though the Nation of Islam wasn't involved in any violent activity, but they had a very militant rhetoric. And it's that militant rhetoric that caused many to say we should embrace, from the white power structure, that's what they called it then, we should embrace Dr. King and the others, as opposed to having to deal with the consequences of the militant liberation theology of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Let's go to the next slide. That movement inspires a young man named Cassius Clay to join the Nation of Islam, and as he accepts the theology of the Nation of Islam, he says that according to his religion, that they should not take part in the wars that take the lives of innocent people. In fact, many of you might know the famous phrase of Muhammad Ali. He said, no